Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Chris Peckham. I'm the Director of Operations at Olivier Corporation.
Good afternoon. My name is Fred Gordy. I'm the Director of Cybersecurity and Intelligent Buildings.
And today we want to talk to you about cybersecurity with best practices in office buildings. So the learning objectives that we have for this session, understand the importance of cybersecurity and how it can impact your business. Reminded of good cyber hygiene practices, what can be done to improve your current environment. And finally, have a better understanding of building control systems, how these systems may be exposed, and what can be done to reduce your cybersecurity risk to them. So with this in mind, our presentation is organized with a few areas. We're going to talk about some simple things, some exposure and operator and management areas, some basic cyber hygiene, current threats to the building system control systems, what is the norm, some easy low-cost wins, and then some time for some Q&A and discussion at the end. So cybersecurity is one of these things you can get many definitions for. So one that's there is basically a state or process of protecting and recovering computer systems, network, and devices from any type of cyber attack. And these can come in many different ways, basically trying to protect your sensitive data, and they may be using social engineering or artificial intelligence to circumvent any traditional security controls that may be there. But in the end, the lack of focus you can have in this area can damage your business, either by economic costs, reputational costs, or regulatory costs that you have to incur to get away from what happened during the event. So a few of the simple things that are there in play that sometimes are used in this area. Phishing exercises, everybody's heard about this for years. People still are exposed to them and click on the link at the wrong time when an email comes in. So some of the things to watch out for when you see this, poor grammar in the email. So if it comes across and the language there is not clean, or a sentence structure, whatever it may be, and it looks a little off, it may be. One of the things that's happened over the last few years is logos have actually been used. You can get something from a bank or another business, and it actually looks like the message came from that particular source. So one of the things you want to make sure of is that the links actually link back to where they're supposed to. So don't trust it just because it looks pretty. One of the latest ones we've even seen internally, and it's kind of funny, is the manager asking you to go out and buy some gift cards and send them to a certain spot, or provide a credit card or whatever it may be to get something, which again is a pretty cute one that's been happening lately. And then finally, wire transfer requests. So somebody will come in, maybe it's the president or somebody as a department head, and will tell somebody within the organization or AP perhaps to wire money to a certain location. And that one's been running around for a while, but amazingly people still do it. So again, phishing, just doing something in email, trying to get your hooks in from that. They're then going to have some type of program that runs or expose information, and those are some of the things you want to watch out there. The other thing that's pretty simple to do is protect your mobile device. So your mobile device has everything on it these days: social media, email, could be your business or personal email account that's there. When that stuff comes in, some of the things, just again, your phone has access to all that stuff. So put a lock code on your phone. You leave it laying around or whatever it may be. Simple thing to do, and will help protect it from somebody picking it up and doing something with it. The other thing you want to do is review your apps every now and then. Look at where the data is going. Make sure you know what's running, why it's running. Is it running in the background? It's an area where somebody, if they're trying to do something malicious, can use that as a vector to get into your area and what you have access to. And then the final piece on the mobile device is just make sure you have the ability to mobile wipe it. So all the big players have the ability for you to set that up on your account. You can then go and tell your phone to wipe itself out if it's lost or if you don't have access to it anymore. So that's another feature that should be done. And again, you can do it on your both personal device as well as your work device. Usually the enterprise has the ability to do that. And then the final thing on the simple portion here is just your accounts. So everybody's heard of two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication. Basically what you're doing there is not only your password is used, but something else that you have in your possession, whether it be some type of token, physical token you put into the machine, or some type of code, either a text message or a one-time password application you may have. That actually helps prevent things from occurring to your account, because you have to know both the password and then something you have in your possession as you get access to it. So it slows things down a little bit. It can be a little bit of a pain sometimes, but the advantage of using it is a good thing. So put that on if you don't have it going. Don't mix your personal and business email. Again, it's just trying to keep things separated out as you move forward and allow things to progress where they need to. And then finally, social media information. Be careful of what you're sharing and that type of thing, and keep that in mind. People will use that as they know more information about you to try to get in if they're doing social engineering or that type of thing. So again, what you have out there, what you share, and that type of thing can needs to be watched as well. Some of the things that need to be done in the environment as well is keep the software updated. So patches are extremely important. Something can occur, and the people that are trying to get into a system, whatever it may be, will use some of those vectors that are in play and some of the software that may not be patched. So keeping these up to date when Windows wants to say hi or the Linux system wants to say hello and wants the updates, those are important. Granted, patch management can be something that's a problem because something you patch may break something else, so you don't want to do it willy-nilly, but at the same time you want to have an understanding of what it is and keep them up to date as possible. I mentioned passwords a couple of times already. Password management is important, so going to have a slide later on. Fred's going to show some stuff that's done, what not to do with a Post-it note. But at the same time, you want to make sure that you have some control over what you use. Don't use the same one all the time, nothing simple, etc. And again, just make sure that you're aware of what you have and keep track of what's used where and be smart about what you're doing. Network access is a big one. Again, we'll talk a little bit about that later on. But who has access to the network? Are they using VPNs to get in? If the VPN can get in, what do they have access to? Where are your wireless routers? Do you have open ports sitting around that somebody that's visiting your facility can just come in and jack into the network and get access to everywhere, unbeknownst to anybody that's operating it? So the ability to get on the network, what you can do once you're on it, are big things you need to watch out for, and you need to watch in some form to prevent things from occurring when you do have access to it. And unsecured network access ties into that somewhat. So if you're in a coffee shop or local area, friend's house, maybe not as large a risk, airport, but it's a free access, just let you come in. They're doing it for a service, but at the same time, somebody can do something malicious on it. And so if you're using something like that, make sure a VPN is in place to protect your traffic, or use your hotspot that you bring along with you that you then know where it's coming from and you only have the telco provider in the middle of it. Data security threats, breaches, phishing we talked about before. The list goes on that type of thing. So backups, data recovery, business continuity, et cetera. Those are big things that are there that will help with data security threats. People want the information. Everything's got a price to it. You can do stuff on the dark web with that. So again, control what you have, protect what you have, and then have a way of mitigating it if something does occur. Who can access your systems? That ties into the network access portion. But know who's on your systems, know who has access to it, know what they can do once they're on it. Again, some of the larger buildings, you have many vendors that are in that type of environment doing different things. They have access to different systems. So who are they? What are they doing? Is their staff stable? Is there a turnover on a regular basis? What happens when somebody leaves, et cetera? So all those things tie into the access portion of it. And then finally, vet the vendors. Is there an assessment process? Do you know who's there? What are they doing? What's their cyber posture? So you could have the tightest thing in the world. You go through the process, and if somebody downstream or in your supply chain isn't up to snuff, then they can have exposure, which would then come into your side, right? Everybody knows about the Target piece years ago with the HVAC system and that type of thing, exposure. So one system can affect what happens in another system. So again, just vet the vendors and make sure everybody's aware of what's going on and you know what's happening in the environment. And the last piece of this one, I'm not going to read all 11 bullet points, but it's here. There's some great information. This comes from the CIS as well as Carnegie Mellon's Center for Engineering Institute, Software Engineering, excuse me. So here you will have a baseline set of practices, manage the most common and pervasive cybersecurity risks. So you want to have an incident response plan if something occurs. There's organizational services. Make sure you have the supporting assets in play for prioritizing what's in play if something does occur. Cyber education and awareness. So does your staff know what can occur, how it can occur, how do they prevent it? Establish some network security and monitoring some type of way. And the last one is there's monitor the malware exposures and that type of thing. Antivirus, make sure that's protected both on your endpoints as well as your servers to reduce that risk. So again, lots of things that are here. Not enough time to go into anything in depth, but again, just some concepts to keep in mind, and some good information here on that link with a whole paper on this type of thing to more information that you can look into or reach out. We can talk about it. Over to you.
All righty. Thank you, Chris. So before we get started, very quickly, I want to point something out that occurred at the end of 2019. NIST, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, released an internal report called number 8228. And in that report, basically what they say is they're acknowledging that operational technology or building control technology cannot be monitored or maintained the same way that IT does things. And for example, is the information technology is what it is. It's data and devices talking to each other to pass data. In my world, the operational technology world, these devices and systems interact with the world in a physical way. So keep that in mind when you're working on your strategy. Is there is a difference, and there's things that you can't necessarily do with an operational technology system that you do with an informational technology system. So I'm going to start with a couple of real world examples. One thing that I hear a lot is people say, well, we never hear anything about these types of attacks. Well, mostly that's because these types of attacks you don't have to report them. You do if it has anything to do with personal data. So that's one of the main reasons is people don't have a reason to report them, so therefore they don't. And as Chris mentioned earlier, brand damage is a very big thing. So keeping it in-house is going to help you on your brand side. Now, however, in this particular first example, one of the things that people don't think about is they're vendors who have nothing to do with them. For example, the parking vendor here. This parking vendor had a system. When I interviewed the people with this building, they said, well, we're not even connected to that. And I said, well, whose name's on the building? Well, sometime later, somebody found the printer to the parking vendor and printed, there's a bomb in the building. Well, you can imagine what happened. It's not if there was something there, but the fact that something was printed, the police had to be called, the building had to be dumped, there was a lot of productivity that was lost, all of the occupants of the building had to be moved out until they figured this out. Well, again, the name of this company is on the building, so who is it that they're going to look at? Next, please. In this particular case, as was mentioned earlier, ransomware is a big problem, and it's a real big problem in my world. In this particular case, somebody got in with ransomware because the guys and I'll show you some examples of this in a minute, the guys that run the systems were actually checking their personal email on the building control front end. That's the application server. And in this particular case, not only did it encrypt the server, but also release some nice little stuff that allowed the bad guys to come in remotely and begin to attack the central plant. This particular case, it took 92 days to fully recover. There were about 1,200 plus people that were affected, and this was a 50-story building. So a lot of impact there. Next, please. In this particular case, this is interesting because this customer had, again, you know how we talked about things are a little bit different in this world? Well, this particular case, there was a trusted employee. He was that facility guy that knew everything. Well, his user was not only in the system so that he could access it, but this particular system required that user to be in there to allow the data and control to pass between the buildings. Well, he got fired, and as a result, IT came in and began removing his user, but what they didn't know was the downstream impact. What it started doing was cutting access to over 100 buildings before they realized what was happening. Well, you can't just put his user back in because nobody knew his password. So in this particular case, I've got on there 6 weeks, but I've later found out that the amount of man hours required to get this back going was over 6,000 man hours. It involved the vendor, It involved the employees of this company, and it also involved the manufacturer, this one, just by removing a user. But you have to know, and this is where, not knocking IT, but it's not their specialty. They don't realize that there's impact in users, and there's sub-users in these systems that if you mess with, you can actually create these kind of problems. Next, please. In this particular case, this was not an attack, but this was an IT-inflicted wound, if you will. In this particular case, there were over 10,000 devices in the building. It had just been freshly commissioned by myself and my team, and the IT came in afterwards and ran a quali-scan. Well, these devices are very sensitive in a respect. You can't hit them with full-on vulnerability scans. You have to do things in a lightweight fashion. And as a result, they knocked over 60% of the over 10,000 devices newly commissioned in this building. So what that meant was they had to go in, and the vendors had to be called back in. There's an expense there. They had to reboot all of these devices manually. So that's, it's over 6,000 devices they had to reboot. And then they had to check or minimally recommission the devices to make sure that they were functioning as they were designed. And again, there's some costing that we do know about this particular situation, and it's rather staggering, but I can't mention the number. Next, please. All right, ransomware, number one threat in the building control world. So that's something you need to keep in mind when you're looking at your building systems, is most of the times the engineers use that front end, is sitting on the engineering desk. I got some pictures of those where they're using them for their personal use, like I mentioned earlier. And as a result, what's happened is the bad guys are realizing that, hey, this is another vector. And they're also finding out, and we run into this, and we actually run phishing campaigns that are OT specific. They figured out that they can craft email messages that look like they're coming from either a tenant in the building or from a manufacturer of the equipment. And so that's why this is being very effective. Next, please. So to give you some stats, we've been collecting them because, as I say, this is what we do day in, day out, is we collect stats, we do assessments, and we check buildings out. What we've seen is between 2019 and 2020, a 600% increase of attacks, primarily ransomware. So again, a lot of that has to do with actually policy. Your users, the building guys, don't know that they can't use this for a personal machine or just surfing the web. Next, please. So here's that example. This is what we find typically when we go into someone's building, is the engineer's application server is sitting on a desk where anybody can get to it, and it's logged in, and the activity is not monitored. Next, please. This particular case, this shows an examples of some things that we found when we've actually gone in and pulled up the front ends to look and see where these users are going to. They're checking Amazon, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. In this particular case, this is a server that was in a rack. It wasn't IT control, but it was in a rack where supposedly nobody should be getting in there, but people on their lunch break would go in there and check their Facebook. Next, please. Here's some more examples of things that we found. LinkedIn, we find that quite a bit. People checking their Office 365, Yahoo, Gmail. Next, please. Now, these are some pictures taken from various different locations that we've gone out and done assessments on. And as you can see, there's some representatives from hospitals, financial groups, banks, military bases, and the military bases can be quite concerning, as you can imagine, because these networks are tied to, they have two types of networks, or two levels of secure networks, and these things we're finding on the first, not the most secure, but the first level, which is still a security. And these are unmanaged switches, And basically that means that I can come in and plug in and nobody knows I'm there. Next, please. Other things we found, as Chris mentioned earlier, this is commonplace, as I'm sure most of you guys know, is people will write down those passwords and usernames and just be open to anyone that happens to walk by or come into this particular room and see this stuff. Next, please. And then lastly, on these screens that I have, is one of the things that is primarily found in building control systems in commercial real estate is the vendor is the primary knowledge keeper and the primary controller of the systems. And what I mean by that is the vendor administers users. They have full access to the system 24/7, but they also do something else. They give the facility guys remote access through a solution that they provide. And a lot of times it's something that may or may not be very secure. Sometimes it's just directly on the web, so they'll have a public IP in there, meaning that I can just open a browser, type in an IP address, and boom, I'm at the login screen of your system, which that's something else we do quite a bit is we hunt for systems for customers. There are two search engines out there that are very prominent. If you don't know about them, check them out. One of them is called Shodan, and that's the one most everybody knows. And then the other is Census, Censys. That particular one is much more robust and gives us, the bad guy / good guy, a lot of information about your system. And the funny thing is when we go do assessments, I hear it time and time again, myself and my team, is we don't have anything exposed. Well, typically we're about 50 to 55% of the time we find something exposed. And when we find that one thing, in one particular customer's case, one of our guys found one IP address, and from there he was able to find over 1,100 devices throughout the United States. So that was a particular customer that said, we have nothing exposed. We've already done we've upgraded our networks and there's nothing exposed, but we were able to find it. But back to this, the vendor's going to give the facility guys remote access, and they do it through stuff like LogMeIn or TeamViewer. But the main point here, and I'm not knocking those two solutions, although there are much secure ways to do things. The point being is if you fire that vendor, now the guys that have become dependent on this system, to your facility guys remotely cannot get in the building anymore. And also, too, is this gives your vendor 24/7 access to your system, which is, in the scheme of things, if you had told an IT guy that, he'd say, you're crazy. We're not going to give our vendors access wholeheartedly 24/7 to our systems. And also, too, the lastly thing on this is you have no accountability. You can't necessarily go in and pull logs to see who's been in the system and who's been doing what. So this also takes away from your ability to track what's going on with your systems. Next screen, please. So what I want to leave you with is, this can sound real scary, and it is a lot to do. There are a lot of things to do. However, using the old adage of the two guys running from the bear, one guy bends down and takes his shoes off, and the other guy says, what are you doing? Why are you taking your shoes off? And he says, I run faster. The other guy says, well, you can't outrun a bear. He said, all I got to do is outrun you. So there's a lot of systems out there that are just ripe for picking. So you can do just a few things that don't cost you a ton of money, may cost you a little bit of time. But so I'm going to lay these out here. Know what you don't know. Almost 90% of the time, or over 90% of the time, when we go in and somebody says, well, we have an inventory of our systems. Case in point, one particular customer, I was working with the vendor. He was sitting there and he was very cooperative. And I said, well, I need to scan your network. And he said, well, I only have 4 devices on there. And I said, well, I understand, but I'm here for verification. So I scanned the network and I found 32 devices. And one of those was a Raspberry Pi. And if you don't know what a Raspberry Pi is, look up NASA, JPL, Raspberry Pi. Raspberry Pi was plugged in by somebody, and the bad guys had 10 months of access to NASA's JPL network, and they stole 500 megs of Mars mission drawings and that kind of thing. So know what you don't know, meaning identify your assets, because in NIST guidelines, one of the first things it says is identify. And you can't protect what you don't know you don't have. What is your exposure? Like I mentioned before, a lot of times these, in order to help out, not doing anything nefarious, the vendors will say, hey, look, we can help you get set up with a public IP that's a direct connect to the web, and we'll just pop this little cellular modem in, and you don't have to contact IT. We got this wrapped up. Or they do the solution with LogMeIn or TeamViewer. The other is vendor management and compliance. Do you control them or do they control you? Like I mentioned before, that remote access piece. But also, too, is the majority of vendors are the ones that are coming in. When they come in to do their service, your facility guys say, hey, we're adding a new guy. Can you add it in? Because they may not know how to do it, and they look at the vendor as like, well, he's servicing the system. I'll get him to do that. The other thing is the vendor may have one username and password that all of his techs do. The company I used to work for before I came to work for Intelligent Buildings, we were the Southeast's largest mechanical contractor. We had thousands of systems out there, and the same username and password was, not anymore because we changed it, from 1998 to 2014 was the same username and password that had been there the entire time, meaning somebody that used to work for us could still get into the system. And also, too, those users, they're not under any kind of compliance guidance, so they don't, however they want to set up your systems, or if you choose to fire them, they can take the data away. There's a thing called separation agreement. The next thing is assess your configurations. Are there default settings in there? Because I guarantee you most of these systems are going to have default settings somewhere, meaning there's a default username and password, which I could look up online and get into your system. This is a biggie. You know, I mentioned ransomware is like the number one thing going on in our industry. And 100% of these could have been taken care of if they were doing good backups. We see backups being backed up directly to the application server, which is the very thing that gets hit, which means it gets encrypted, or the backup is going with the vendor out the door. No storage is happening at your location. And then also backup right. And what I mean by that is the controllers that are out in the field, they need to be backed up too, and that's not necessarily an automated process, so you need to work that out. And then train your people and your vendors. Make them aware of your cybersecurity practices, not just IT-wise, but OT-wise. So with that, I'm going to hand it back.
All right, and that wraps up what we wanted to discuss here. Some simple things: operator management exposure, some cyber hygiene, current that's in the building control area. What are some of the norms, some easy wins that Fred just discussed? And with that, we'll open it up to some Q&A. Thank you very much.